And is there nothing more important than boards of directors working with the organizations to drive change? Everybody agree? And how lucky we are, first of all, to partner with Diligent, Lisa, on really driving change. And to think about, as we look at, and Dottie, with the Diligent Institute, with your board report that you released all over the world showing differences. I think you show we're 24% women on boards. In the US, we think we're 27%, but oh, too slow, particularly for women of color. Everybody agree? We want to say how lucky we are to work with 27 different board organizations, and all of them working to really drive change and measure together. So whether it's 50-50 women on boards or 30% club or Latino corporate directors and on, it is joining together to see these number changes. And at WBC, you know, we work with Equilar, and every month with Gwen and the team, we publish a report on public boards. And those numbers were trending over 22 months since we've been doing it, about 40% women joining public boards. And out of that, 60% were first-time board members. That's amazing. And a third of those women of color. The last 2 months, we're falling back to 30%, 32%. We hope it's not the economy and not that we're not putting the focus, and that we'll get back to where we were from George Floyd on. But those are the numbers change. And when we say diligent, we are being diligent about the numbers. And we also look at private boards, and we look at venture capital boards, because we know, and Lisa knows, we all know, how far we have to come by changing the way the capital flow on those boards. So all of that is so important. How proud we are today when we look at this group. And then how great Tony Leatherberry is. We worked together all these years, and your board chairman is here with us today, right? And Maria, and to Paula, and to Mary, and to Pam Craig. So Pam, we've known each other a long time, but if anybody's looked at a change leader and someone who has supported other women, and we heard Nellie at Accenture recognize Pam. Pam was a force, because how many of us spent decades at Accenture moving up, ending up being the chief financial officer? But as you've gone on boards, Pam, and now as you lead the Women's Forum of New York, and I think as we, Paula, have gone to the Women's Forum of New York and that breakfast, heard how many women spend their lives advancing other women to boards. And Pam, you've led that cause. The other big point that you've made, and that Diligent makes to us, is board leadership on committees, right? So, Tony, you said, and Singleton McAllister said, there are only 3 women running board chairs that are black, all right? Only 3. So what we have to be is so cognizant across the board. And Pam, we look and we can name each one of your boards and what you're chairing, whether it's technology or audit or gov, because each of you, Paula, Maria, we're just thrilled, because the group that we had was representing 19 major boards up here. And if we talk about leadership and drivers of change, we turn it over to this panel now, and we thank you. And we thank Diligent, because it is this integrated role of you as change leaders. Pam?
Great. Thank you, Edie, for the kind introduction and for all the energy that you create for all of us. As Edie mentioned, we're both members of C200, and Kimber, our chair, is here as well, one of the big WBC partners. And Edie, you were a founding member there. And so, Edie has been working on behalf of women for almost half a century, you all. I mean, it's really, it's really great. And so when Edie and I first spoke about this idea, about having women around a board table, we thought, okay, we'll be around a table, and we're going to have really accomplished, diverse women directors. So please imagine that we're around a board table. We're working on it.
Are we still going to the glass boardroom?
We're going to do it. Yeah.
So someday there'll be a glass boardroom with another panel, undoubtedly, or another table of women. I also just want to talk a little bit about the Women's Forum of New York, which is another WBC partner organization right here in the city. And as Edie mentioned, I'm serving a 2-year term as president. And we do have a corporate board initiative that hosts a breakfast every 2 years, and we started it in 2011. And at that time, we were celebrating, and there weren't that many companies that had 20% women representation on boards. So next year, we're going to be doing our 6th or 7th one, I can't remember now, and we will be celebrating 40% or more, and there's a lot of them. So it's very, very good progress. And Paula, Maria, and Mary are all here also from the Women's Forum of New York. Okay. And I can't help but mention Maria, serendipitously, is a board member of Wells Fargo. And she, and she signed up for this, being on this panel long before we knew we were going to be here. We went back when we were going to be in the glass house in downtown. So anyway, and Tony and Lisa, thank you for being here. Our bios I know you've seen. But we thought we would just each do a quick introduction of our background, and then we're going to get into some questions. So I'll start. I'm Pamela Craig. My business career, as you heard, was at Accenture, where I spent 34 years. And most of that time, I was working with clients, leading big technology or finance programs. But when Accenture went public in 2001, I became part of the management team. And actually, my first project was probably my hardest consulting project ever, which was trying to turn a company of 47 partnerships into a publicly listed company on the New York Stock Exchange. So luckily, Sarbanes-Oxley hit right at the same time, and I was we were the only company that was actually happy about that, because all of a sudden there was a mandate. We had to do it. So we did all that. I spent my last 7 years as CFO and retired from Accenture in 2013. And since then, I've been on 7 public boards, and I currently serve on 4. Merck in pharmaceuticals, 3M, which is an innovative industrial conglomerate, still based in Minnesota, Progressive Insurance, which you may be familiar with. We have a woman CEO, Tricia Griffith, Cleveland, Ohio, Flo, maybe you've... And finally, Corning, which is my most recent one, which has reinvented itself to manufacture very high-tech glass that basically is the fiber networks that carries our traffic all over the world, big screens, autos, and also for life sciences. As is typical, I serve on 2 committees on each of the boards. Most of us probably do. And I chair the audit committee at Merck, the tech committee at Progressive, and the compensation and talent committee at 3M. I also just want to do numbers, and I asked everyone to do the numbers too. Merck has 6 women on his board, so we're in the kind of mid 40% there, and it's really exciting to have 6 women on our board. 3M has 4 women, smaller board, so it's actually close to 40% as well. Progressive, 50-50. I was talking to Lisa earlier. 6 and 6. Yes, Tricia again. And also Corning has 4, which is in their case about 30%. But I got to tell you, 4, 5, 6 women, it makes a difference. I think many of you maybe remember, if any of you have served on a board with just 1, it's just not as fun, and it's harder to be impactful. It really, really is. So I dare say that many of the great men that we all serve with also think it's a good thing. So anyway, let me turn now to let us start our own introductions. Maria, starting with you.
Sure. First of all, it's a privilege to be here. I also want to thank Wells Fargo and Edie and Diligent. My background, very similar to Pam. I was 34 years at MetLife, which, as you may know, is an insurance and financial services company. The last 3 roles I had, I was on the executive committee there. And I was really fortunate because I had the opportunity to run many P&Ls, but also lead marketing and technology and operations for the organization. And I don't know that I understood how important those capabilities would be as I started to think about my next chapter in terms of going onto boards. I sit on S&P Global, who you may know, financial services company, and I joined there in 2016 while I was still an executive. And I think that's important from a woman's perspective because boards are looking for contemporaneous leaders, current backgrounds, and so being able to join as an executive was fantastic. I retired in 2017 and joined Wells Fargo in 2018, and then in 2019 I joined a privately held Resolution Life. All 3 financial services companies, so different than you're going to hear on the panel. But in terms of leadership, in S&P Global, I chair the audit committee, and I'm a member of the executive committee and finance committee. In Wells Fargo, I chair the risk committee. I also chair the bank's regulatory compliance and oversight committee and sit on the HR committee. And in Resolution Life, I chair the comp and conflict of interest committee. You know, Pam was talking a little bit about the interaction of having more women on boards. I also think that boards thinking about diversity and inclusion has enabled them to really widen the pool of who they can consider for board members. So what I'm seeing is people need more around ESG, around digital, AI, cyber, risk management. Women are often in these roles and they're at the top of their game. So I think it gives us the opportunity to bring in more diverse leaders, more women leaders, and I see a real difference. In terms of percentage of women, in Wells Fargo we've got 37%, and in S&P Global we have 40% with 5 women on both boards. And really, again, it's just going to be a privilege to be here and I'm looking forward to the dialogue.
Thanks,
Going this
Maria.
way?
Tony?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tony Leatherberry. Honored to be here whenever Edie calls. I try to answer. Thank you again, Wells Fargo. Thank you, Diligent. This is a very important topic, very important day. I grew up in manufacturing and in consulting financial services. I've spent over 38 years creating opportunities to optimize businesses by integrating technology and coming up with overall business capabilities and solutions. And coming back to Maria's point, I'm a little bit of an odd duck because I didn't have that CXO title. Even though I led large P&Ls within Deloitte and was a senior partner, and I was on our comp committees and on our nom-gov committees within Deloitte, it's a little bit different than when you're in industry. And so I would say I had the opportunity to join the awesome boards that I'm a member of now in serving because of my technical capabilities. And so when we look at opportunities, particularly for women and women of color and people of color, we need to be thinking about those skill sets and competencies that they bring to the table. I am proud to see my CEO in the room, and you'll hear from her in an hour or so. And on our board, we're better than 40% represented by women, and it's something to be proud of. And there isn't a conversation that we have in that boardroom that doesn't include our perspective in terms of diversity, in terms of ESG. And so I see the dialogue shifting. I also serve on the board of American Family Insurance, which is a private mutual insurance company, and we have greater than 40% representation there. And I'm also the lead director of a small startup that, interestingly enough, the entire leadership team is diverse. And the board is represented by greater than 60% of women or people of color. I serve on risk committees for 2 of those boards, and I serve on the HR comp committees for 2 of those boards and the audit committee for 1 of those boards.
Excellent. I love these points about widening the pool. Really, really good. Paula.
Hi, everybody. I am so thrilled to be here on this esteemed panel and with all of you in this room. Thank you, Edie, Pam, Wells Fargo, and Diligent for having me. So my boards are Accenture, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Warner Brothers Discovery, which was newly formed as part of a merger. And on those boards, I serve on the audit committee for all three. I am the audit committee chair for Accenture, for Warner Brothers Discovery, and I am on the now we're the compensation, culture, and people committee for Accenture, and on the nominating governance committee for Bristol Myers Squibb. In terms of board composition, I'm really proud to say that Accenture has 50% women and 60% racial and ethnic diversity. And that has been a journey. And I was talking to Pam earlier about the Accenture journey, and she was certainly part of it. In fact, part of the first two women on our board, one of whose seats I have. And what we have in place there is a policy that says when we're recruiting for boards, we must have a diverse slate. And we think about diversity in the broadest sense. I think many boards have moved to this, especially as we've seen that we need certain skills like technology and cybersecurity, transformational skills. We think about it in the broadest possible sense. And our 50% includes our chairman and CEO, Julie Sweet. Then Bristol Myers Squibb has 40% women and 40% ethnic and racial diversity. And Warner Brothers Discovery has 25% women, all of whom are racially or ethnically diverse, and 40% ethnic and racial diversity. So I'm really proud of the movement that we've seen in those statistics over the years. My career, my last executive role was as Chief Financial Officer of Macy's. Before that, I worked across sectors, so financial services, consumer products and retail, mostly consumer products and retail, strategy, general management, and finance and accounting, mostly finance and accounting. And I've worked in the US and in the UK at global companies. And I believe that that diversity of experience is my superpower when it comes to being on a board and contributing at the board level.
Boards are lucky to have you. Thank you, Paula. Moving on to Lisa.
Hi, everyone. I spoke earlier, but I'm Lisa Edwards, President and CEO of Diligent and incoming Executive Chair of the Diligent Institute. So for those of you who aren't aware of the Diligent Institute, it is basically primary research on issues facing mostly directors, but we mine about 5,000 proxies, 3,000 in the US, 2,000 internationally. We also do deep proxy analysis on shareholder activism and things like that. So that's what you can find as a part of the Diligent Institute. I sit on the board of Colgate-Palmolive on the NomGov and finance committees. And I would say we also have a nicely diverse board. So we are about 40% women, we are exactly 40% women, 20% people of color, 10% LGBTQ+. And I would say, when the fourth woman joined, it was a sort of, it really sort of felt like the room tone changed a little bit. So that has been a fantastic experience. My career has been spent in tech and fintech. So I was 7.5 years at Visa and then 8.5 years at Salesforce prior to moving over to Diligent, and really have made what I'm thinking of as my last operating role in a way to how do I give back and how do I use the position of Diligent to help promote these issues and help get more gender diversity, racial diversity, sexual orientation diversity on boards of directors. I think it's incredibly important that we reflect the communities that we work in, our employee base and our customer base when we think about how we are showing up in leadership. I also have a strong belief that that diversity begets diversity. So when you see, it does not surprise me at all that the 100% board, because at some point it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy a little bit. So very pleased to be here, and thank you all for attending today.
Thank you, Lisa. And last but certainly not least, both a board director and a CEO, Mary.
Thank you, and thanks everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity, Edie, Pam, Diligent, Wells Fargo, to be here today. I am a career tech industry person. I have an engineering background. I actually started at Compaq Computer as Engineer 1 and ultimately became an officer of the publicly traded company and running their most profitable business, which I ultimately transitioned to HP as part of that merger. I transitioned from HP to Nokia, where I was an officer of that company, running their feature phone business, which is pejoratively called the dumb phone business, but very, very global with over 40% of revenues coming from emerging markets, so lots and lots of travel to very interesting places. I've had the opportunity to work with private equity. I was an executive partner at Cirrus Capital. I've been CEO of Polycom, which you may know from the speakerphone in your conference rooms. I've been CEO of Mitel Networks, and I exited the CEO role in November of last year and became the chair. So I'm chairing that private board now. I also sit on the board of Autodesk. As part of Nokia Executive Development, they asked us to join a public board. I was spending my life in Finland and realized I needed to know someone in California if I ever wanted to come home. So I targeted California software and internet companies and have had the privilege of being on Autodesk's expansion from a market cap of around 3 to close to 50 billion. So it's really been a tremendous ride. I chair comp for them. In the tradition of the glass shard, I got the chair role after 2 years in a row of no on say on pay, but was able to fix that. At Autodesk, we have a majority of women directors, and all committees are chaired by women. So, yeah, very progressive. I also sit on the board, another publicly traded company in the UK called the Informa Group that does B2B services for the knowledge workers, so academic publishing, exhibitions, and events, and have recently become their senior independent director. I've also been on 2 other public boards. One, just to note, I had the opportunity to work with Helen Alexander, who was one of the co-authors of the Hampton-Alexander Report, which was so pivotal in driving women on boards in the UK. She was chair of a company called UBM, and I was very privileged to serve on her board before she sadly passed in 2018. So really excited about the conversation today, and really hoping that we continue the momentum and make more progress to improve the diversity of boards.
Mary's got some great stories, which she'll be sharing later about Autodesk and the UK events company. What's it called? I'm sorry.
Informa.
Informa. So stay tuned. Okay, so let's get started. And you heard from Lisa here, and I wanted to just put in my little plug for Diligent. Actually, we use that software for all 4 of the boards that I'm on. Probably most of us use it at least one, maybe the majority, maybe all. And it really is the software of choice these days as a tool for board directors to prepare and then also to, act and follow up from board meetings. Basically, all approvals now, I think, are done on Diligent, which really makes it easy because unanimous written consents used to be a real pain. And so it's great that we can do them on Diligent now.
I swear I did not pay her to say that.
But we are going to start with Lisa sharing with us. We got a little from Edie, but let's just a little more detail from Lisa on just what's the most recent data on women on boards. I mean, we have made a lot of progress. Not everything's linear in terms of how it changes, but let's just be grounded in the latest facts and understand that progress as well as the opportunity that we still have.
Sure. As Edie noted, we are in the high 20s on women in boards, and it really varies quite a bit globally. You see France at 43%. That's not a mistake. They passed a law in France requiring 40%. The EU has now followed suit, so we should see those numbers continuing to climb in Europe. Then there are places like the UAE where it's at 8.9%. But I think it's important to note that that was 3% a couple of years ago too. So very slow progress, but some progress even there. When we look at the incoming class, if you will, of directors nominated to boards this year, the first half of the year was 36% women. So I always sort of look at what is the install base for the data geeks amongst us, and then are we marginally improving that install base? So the answer to that is yes. It's a slow path though. So if you think about the average tenure on boards, it's quite long. It's also longer for women than longer for men than for women. So if the average tenure is long, then only around between say 10 to 20% is turning over every year. You actually need quite a few years of that overrepresented numbers coming in to really move the needle. So we're about 4% higher than we were a couple of years ago. One thing that I do think is really interesting is I feel and see the need for former CEOs and former CFOs on boards. It's just an incredibly important role to have on your board of directors, to have your CEO have someone who has walked in their shoes, mostly walked in his shoes, let's face it, and someone who can provide that sounding board. So I will never sit up here and tell you we should not have CEOs on the boards, but I do think that we have also all of these new skills that are coming into the market around ESG matters, around cyber, around human capital with the pandemic in ways that we never had before. So we are seeing around over 40% of the skill set coming in to the board are these sort of new non-C-suite members that are more representative of things like cyber or diversity or sustainability. So I think these are all positive, sort of moves and going in the right direction. And, I think it's just sort of up to all of us on boards to continue the momentum around that.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. So I thought what would be good to start with here is let's just think about the change of the last 3 years. There's just been so much that's happened in companies, with workforces, on boards, et cetera. The impact of the pandemic, we got to see the leaders up close and personal, I think, those of us who were on boards, just in terms of how that all worked. The challenges of recruiting during the Great Resignation, and how DEI improved or didn't during that period. And we're going to get to the future in a minute, because that's another whole bailiwick. But I would love to hear from all of you. Maria, why don't you start? Just reflect a little about these last 3 years.
Sure. First of all, it's remarkable that we're all back here in person and nodding and smiling, and the energy you get from this is amazing. And yet, certainly my boards did really well in terms of moving quickly to digital, moving quickly to video, and actually governing well, very well, throughout the pandemic. For board work, we went from meeting 7-8 times a year, and then obviously with audit committees, we had our quarterlies, to once a week. We were meeting weekly on Sundays. We were engaged with the management team on the rapid change that had to happen throughout first COVID, everybody then moving home, but then all the other things that came up as a result of it. Supply chain issues, all the issues related now to the volatile economic environment, the geopolitical issues. So boards were much more engaged, at least mine were, with the management team throughout the transformational change that had to happen. I'd say a couple things in terms of what happened for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Certainly for my boards, the CEOs stepped back and said, this is also an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity to bring in new talent. It's an opportunity for us to really understand the talent we have and start promoting people. So we saw our DEI numbers go up at every segment across both S&P Global and Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo went on also to report their first DEI report, which I think you heard from Bay earlier this year. And also we will be doing an equity audit. We announced that in September as well. So we took the opportunity to really step back and say, how do we forward our talent agenda? And in Wells Fargo, one of the best practices that we actually put in place during the pandemic was actually late 2020 2020 was a new head of diverse segments, representation, and inclusion. And I loved the panel that just spoke about the roles of DEI executives, because Wells Fargo's done something really similar, which is it's a much broader role than an HR role. It's all about the business. It's all about serving our customers and looking like our customers, serving underserved communities, and then also our employee base, and really creating the opportunity for the CEO to hear directly from diverse employees. So one of the things that they did, which I thought was amazing, is they started these, in addition to employee resource groups, they started executive leadership groups around Black and people of color, Latin American, Asian, and the most recent ones, women, which interestingly didn't exist. But these groups actually work directly with the head of DEI as well as the CEO, giving him input into how things should come together. And one other quick example of how the DEI agenda continued during this time period is S&P Global, where we had a CHRO. That CHRO was moving on. We brought in a chief people officer. And the board was very involved in that name change from CHRO to chief people officer. Well, fast forward 3 years, she is now the chief purpose officer, and she has a lot more things reporting to her than just HR.
I'd love to hear from everyone on this topic. So, Paula, you want to go next?
Yeah, I would just add that during this time, what was really interesting to see was how many CEOs were out front and center speaking out about the importance of diversity and really taking a stand against racism in particular. But it was also a time for us to take a step back and reflect on everything that we went through during the pandemic. You know, we were home in isolation, which again gave us the opportunity to sort of really see the ugliness of social injustice play over and over in a loop. And that moved people, and people were changed as a result of that. So you saw CEOs coming back or stepping out, taking public stances, coming back into the organization, looking at DEI overall, setting goals, being very public about those goals. The goals were much more aggressive, I would say, than they were before the pandemic. This is across companies. So we really saw some tangible movement, not just in the words, but also in the actions. And I think that's all for the better. And the challenge, of course, will be to make sure that we can sustain this sort of movement and interest in these goals and statistics.
Exactly. Tony, you want to add anything?
Yes, a couple of things. I, interestingly enough, started on both of my boards during the pandemic. So I was that odd person that didn't have the opportunity or luxury of engaging with my board physically.
You hadn't met them, probably.
I hadn't, you know, everything was Zoom. My interview was Zoom. I think my dog sealed the deal for Zoetis as he walked across the couch when I'm interviewing with Kristen, and I said, Ziggy sealed the deal, and I gave him a treat after that interview. But seriously, so you're isolated, and there is a culture within that boardroom that has been established. So there was a lot of reach out and engagement that way, a lot of one-on-one Zoom calls, if you will, to sort of build that rapport. One of the things that I will also mention, and doing a lot of work with Edie and others that are in this room, I see Balaji just walked in, we did a lot to develop boardroom talent before the pandemic even occurred. So I heard on an earlier panel someone say, we can't find the talent. Well, we knew where the talent was because we had been developing it. So whether it was doing analysis around boardroom diversity with one organization, or whether or not it was actually doing a series of development programs with the Executive Leadership Council, we were building momentum around boardroom talent. And so not a month goes by, or maybe even a week, where the phone isn't ringing saying, I'm looking for someone that might have this profile. And I think that is a good news story coming out of the pandemic. It's a little bit different.
Excellent. Mary, I think you have a business story, which a business transformation story, which she shared with me the other day, and I think it'd be great for you to share with all of us.
Yeah, so I mentioned I'm on the board of Informa, and so half the business, or less than half the business, is academic publishing, which actually pretty subscription oriented, did quite well during the pandemic. So that was the bedrock. The other part was exhibitions and events. So imagine Hong Kong Jewelry Show, the Black Hat conferences, Miami Yacht Show. They have shows in all industries. And so the company revenues went from 2.9 billion pounds to 1.6 year over year. So imagine that kind of just abrupt fall off. What was so impressive about this company is they reacted in a way that was very consistent with highest ethical standards, I believe, really strong values. So their stated objective was to provide protection for their employees, for their customers and customer relationships, and of course their brands. So they did the normal things that everybody was doing: freeze recruitment, look for low-hanging fruit on cost, try to postpone events. Thank you. Try to postpone events, and I will say, you know, everybody thought we'd be back in the fall, then you had to postpone them again and convince customers not to take their money back. They did a lot of great things like that. But there were also symbolic things. The CEO, the executive team, and the board all taking salary cuts. We were meeting weekly as well. You know, how bad is it going to be? Where's the bottom going to be? But then the team really believed in the value of their product. So they got in front of it with the city and actually did a new equity raise of £1 billion. They floated new euro bonds. So they graduated or emerged into 21 with actually the business at cash flow positive, with about $1 billion in liquidity, nothing coming due before 2023, and they accepted no government money. So it was quite an impressive story, all while, as I said, relentless communication to their employees about what opportunities were, and they provided choices to employees. Would you like to take a sabbatical at a lesser salary? Would you like to take voluntary severance at a nice package? All kinds of choices, relentless communication. So in addition to all the great financial results, employee engagement was in the 90s. So really, really well done.
Good story. Did you want to?
Sure. Just a thought, kind of to pile on changes from the pandemic. I do think that human capital matters became a very, very frequent topic of conversation in the boardroom. And we unsurprisingly have data on this as well. The number of companies that talked about ESG related matters at nearly every meeting went up from 15% to into the mid-30s. The number of companies that rarely or never talked about ESG went from 20% down to 4%. I always have a question of who the 4% are, because I don't know how you get away with not ever talking about these issues, because ESG as a topic matter is so broad. But I do think when you look at the pandemic and you look at, there was George Floyd kind of at one end of it, but then there was sort of the, remote work, and how do you handle that, and the implications on real estate and your capital allocation. And then there was mental health, and then there was how do we get people back to work. And, it has been this sort of cycle of things where it's become a very, common topic of conversation in the boardroom, because it is so key to the health of the organization. And I think that was a, sort of a real awakening for a lot of boards, that this is something that we need to talk about on a regular basis.
Great. So last week, the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, I saw him at a forum, and he was pitching heavily, get back to work. And as you can imagine, with the financial ecosystem here in New York, of all the things that go around these big buildings that we're in, you can see why he'd be saying that. And he was saying, okay, fine, start at 3 days a week, but go to 4. I mean, is that where we're headed? Do you think we're at 3 days, 4 days? I don't know. How many say 3 days? Yeah. 4 days? I'm a big believer that 4 days is where we're going to land. 5 days? Nobody's voting. What do you think?
2
1
days.
day?
2 days.
0 days? 2 days. How about 2 days? Oh, interesting. Interesting. Okay. Well, we're a ways from that, I would say. But this is something that also comes up. I feel like at every board meeting, like, how are we doing with this? And I guess the bottom line is it's slow. It's probably going to take a while, and probably not going to go all the way to 5 days, which might be good from a quality of life perspective.
Pam, are we allowed to say all of the above?
Right. Which is even more complexity, right?
And more flexibility needed, et cetera, because every class of workers different. We had people that were essential workers that were in 5 days a week all the way through, or 6 days a week all the way through the pandemic, to people that maybe never come back to the office because they don't need to.
Yep. So I want to delve into DEI a little bit more from the board perspective. We had such great panels this morning, and some of you, Nellie, others have stuck around. Thank you. There's 3 words here, right? Diversity, which I think is the one we talk about the most. There's equity, which is typically pay, but it's opportunity and other things. And then inclusion, which is really a lot about culture. How do we encourage intention on all 3 of those dimensions from the boardroom? And Tony, I want to start with you this time.
Sure, and I'm glad you recognize that those are not one and the same. I'm going to start with equity because I think that's the hardest one. It's the one that's more esoteric. And when we think about equity, pay equity is an easy measure to look at. You know, how are we doing across the board? Are we aligning equity with ratings? How are we rating anybody who's not a white male, if you will, and comparing that? But equity should also extend into, are we giving people experiences and opportunity? Because as we start to have the promotion discussions, if people haven't had certain experiences and opportunity, then it's much tougher for them to move up. That also includes how we show up and behave as leaders, whether it's in the boardroom or whether it's the executive suite. And what I mean by that is, who are we willing to take a risk on? And what do we need to do to make sure that they have an environment, the support mechanisms, and the sponsorship? Someone mentioned sponsorship in an earlier panel, to be successful. And I've seen that is where we often will fall down. The person has all the talent in the world, all the skill sets in the world, and we put them in this situation and we're not sensitive to the nuances of the dynamics that they're going to deal with. And that's where they then fail. And are we willing to allow them to fail and learn from that and continue to move on? So that's what I would challenge all of us with. Inclusion is definitely about culture. I couldn't agree with that more. And I think the best way you really can measure that is just doing these pulse surveys besides your overall engagement surveys, and making sure that you're asking questions related to inclusion. As a boardroom, in the boardrooms that I sit in, we will review that with the lead of talent on a periodic basis and make sure that we understand what those pulse surveys are telling us and challenging ourselves to how that we can do that differently. And diversity needs to be diversity in the holistic sense. And I'm going to put something out here that's a little bit sensitive. You know, we often talk about diversity and we talk about everybody who is not a white male cisgender person. And we've got to start thinking about the white male cisgender person too in that equation. And that might sound a little unpopular in this room, but I'm putting it out there anyway. And because we've got to look at equity for everyone, an opportunity for everyone, we have to have those diverse slates. We've got to make sure that we are investing in the white male and developing him to be a more inclusive leader as well. So I'm just going to put that out there. Somebody's going, amen. So just consider that when you're in the boardroom or as a senior leader or a diversity and inclusion leader, how do we bring the white male into this mosaic so that it's equitable for everyone?
So that they're part of the team and not threatened by all this going on. It's really good, Tony.
Just the one other piece I want to add around equity is health equity, because I'm on the Bristol Myers Squibb board, and it's a place where they can really distinguish themselves And in particular, it's making sure that we're included in some of the clinical trials so that when new drugs come out, they have data on how it impacts certain genders and certain races and ethnic classes. So I think health equity is also a very important piece of the whole DEI conversation.
It's such a good point, Paula. I mean, who knew that that wasn't being done? But it wasn't. I mean, it was
Well,
really.
there's tons of examples of that too, right? In product development, the phone is not optimized for a woman's hand. In car development, they did not have female test dummies until the mid tens of the 2000s, so that 47% more injuries in cars were women. There's so many examples where we can layer these things in on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly. Tony, I just want to, with all the things you mentioned, I think talk a little bit, some of you, on what we now are demanding in the boardroom. I mean, when I first went on boards, I didn't demand diversity statistics. I didn't demand the information on equity and pay. I didn't demand the surveys, the pulse surveys that give you a sense of what's going on in the organization. Are we demanding that now? Or are we getting it without demanding it?
Yeah, I think, and we had talked about this a little bit in our prep, that so many compensation committees have expanded to be comp and HR or people or some broader remit.
Talent.
And while, of course, our statutory responsibility is around pay for the named executive officers, we're looking at pay across the board. We're looking at equity in pay. We're looking at culture. Yeah, I think the demands are, and where I've seen the conversations get especially interesting is as you start to think about succession planning. Everybody sort of knows the next in line, but really what is that pipeline where there's still time to have an impact on it? And if you're not seeing greater representation, those conversations I think are starting to happen and are long overdue.
If I could add to that, I think it's gone beyond just looking at a snapshot in time of tell me about your gender diversity. First of all, the diversity statistics have gotten more detailed, and then I think the inputs and outputs have gotten more detailed. So not just where are we today, but on the hiring class, what is that percentage? Is that positively or negatively impacting the base? On the attrition and on the voluntary versus involuntary attrition, what does that look like? On time to promotion and promotion class, what does that look like? And I think when we sort of, I'm a firm believer that sunlight is the best, disinfectant. And when we look at it, and people know that we're looking at it, then I think just more attention is paid to it.
Absolutely.
I would just add, too, the CEO scorecards, at least my CEOs, it's on their scorecard. So we hear about it, the metrics, obviously, regularly in the boardroom, but quarterly, the CEO is reporting out and kind of how they're both taking the lead in terms of a lot of this work. The only other thing I would mention, too, on succession planning that I found really helpful was we look at people in the pipeline even as far out as 7 years, to go back to that development issue. But we're also, and I think this was a board ask, looking at outside candidates and having a whole list of outside candidates for key roles, because you can get to some of that diversity that way as well.
Many of you probably know Shelley Archambault. She always says, if you think you have a pipeline problem, you're looking up the wrong pipe.
Right.
The other thing I would add is that at Accenture, for example, we've changed the name of our comp committee to Compensation, Culture, and People, which is really a mouthful, but it forces you every time we say that to think about the importance of people and culture to achieving our strategy. And so in that committee, we get data every quarter. Nellie could tell you on DEI statistics, the company has made a commitment to, by 2025, to be 50-50 in terms of gender representation across the whole company. And that's 700,000 employees, so 50%. So we're constantly looking at the data, and the goals around all aspects of DEI are really public. So we're looking at the data, we're probing where aren't we making the progress we need to, we're celebrating where we have, just to make sure that we stay on track. And I can remember a time, because I've been on this board in particular longest, where we did have to ask for the data, but now it's more data than we
used
could
to
ever
say
ask
lawyers
for.
won't let us. It's like,
Yeah.
And Pam, just to add one other example. One of the boards that I serve on does a masterful job of looking at representation by business unit. So coming back to Maria's point of tying it to compensation, they're holding those
Leaders of those business units.
of those business units accountable, and they are looking at all of those dimensions. And is, the trend going up? Is the trend going down? And any then colorful commentary as to why things might be changing.
And just maybe to add on that, looking at that data by officer of the company and then using that as a modifier on equity awards. So, real teeth in it.
Modifier meaning up 5, up, down 5, something like that, right? Yeah. So this is great. I mean, it sounds like on all of our boards we're doing this. Certainly you should be expecting on all of the companies you work with that your board is doing that, and I think that's another good example of progress. I want to maybe turn to a couple more provocative questions, and that is, have you seen a situation where the focus on DEI wasn't authentic or wasn't, it really didn't work? And what did you do about it? Anybody have an example of that? Maria.
I mean, it's not systemically, because I think systemically, the companies I work with, it's part of their strategy. So it's embedded in the strategy, and for it to be authentic, it needs to be. So going back to if you're going to pay for performance, et cetera, it's got to be, you've got to have a reason to be doing this, and it's got to be embedded in everything that we do. But we've had situations, certainly in both of my public boards as well as my private board, where we thought certain processes were working in a certain way, and we got the data, and if the data wasn't showing that process was actually, gleaning what we expected, that was kind of self-reported by the management team to the board, and then they had a whole, kind of remediation approach and an action plan around it. And what I like about that is not everything's going to work. So, you think you're doing the right thing. You put a lot of processes in place. You got 600,000 employees or 200,000 employees or 20,000 employees. And these processes are there for the right reasons, and they are authentic, but not every one of them is going to have the outcome that it needs. And the fact that we now have the metrics and we've got leaders who really believe in this and want to ensure that every process they put in place does get it to the right place is important.
And I mean, listen, this has been a journey. So it's not, we haven't always been where we are today. And there have been times when, you literally, as I mentioned before, had to pound the table and say, let's look at the data. And then let's look at the data again. And let's keep looking at the data. I've yet to meet a CEO who likes to see their data stay stagnant, especially if it's not good data. They always want to see it improve. But it goes to the importance of having more than one woman on the board, more than one person of color on the board, and you have more voices, that can persuade the rest of the board, hey, this should be a regular agenda item. We should be staring at the data. I'm very comfortable with starting with the data. We should be staring at the data and discussing the data, and doing that until we see positive change. It seems like a long time ago, right? But we now have, it wasn't, right? We now have the pandemic and the social injustice that became more visible during that time, where, everybody is interested in talking about it. And the data is more forthcoming. We've reorganized our committees so that it will be more forthcoming. So, it feels like, a whole different time period, but it wasn't that long ago where we did have to pound the table and insist upon movement as opposed to lip service.
It's really well put, Paula, and I think I've experienced that as well. I mean, I think that management teams now recognize that they really must share what's going on, even if it isn't good news. And I think the good news is then we can engage and we can help support as they try to change. So one of the boards, this just happened last week, has a very strong DE&I leader, and the programs are going well. And we heard a lot today about really good programs that people are doing. But I asked her what she worries about, and she said, DEI fatigue. And so how does the board consider that if you found that in one of your companies? Has that come up in any of your boards? Anybody?
Well, I'll say I was watching CNBC 2 or 3 hours ago, and there was a whole segment on, should companies be having these conversations again? So I think we've all seen those conversations, and I know there was the action with Starbucks in the last 10 days or so.
I'm going to get to that in a
Yeah.
second.
But so I think I don't see fatigue. I see, the male members of my board, leaning into it as well. And I do think that more companies have taken it and embedded it into their strategic planning and their strategic considerations, their M&A activities. And I think when that happens, it becomes more just a part of the conversation. I think where it can go wrong is when it is an HR issue. And it's somebody's job. It's like that person's job over there, and we all just do our stuff, and then they come talk to us every once in a while. So I think when it is embedded, it goes really well. When it's somebody else's job, then I think there's still work to do.
Yeah, I
Mary?
wouldn't say fatigue. I think it's perhaps a growing awareness that this is not a one and done. As you say, it's a journey. And so we did all this work. We spent all this time. Like, aren't we good? Can we move? It's like, no. Are people really getting embedded in and embracing these principles in the organization? Is the culture really changing? As you say, is it part of the business and not part of some offshoot? And I don't think we're there yet. So we're going to have to keep pushing.
Yeah, my takeaway was, wow, we got to make sure we keep supporting her because it's tough. And when you're facing backlash, minimal as it is, and I love this focus on white men because actually they're graduating from college in fewer and fewer numbers. I mean, they're going to be. This is and so how do we make it the broader discussion about talent, and won't it be great when we are there and can truly do that? So Lisa started to mention the Starbucks thing. Have any of you heard of that? But this is interesting because this suit that was filed against the executives and the directors, not the company, people. So the suit is filed against people, executive and directors. It's about 6 weeks ago by a conservative think tank called the National Center for Public Policy Research. And it stated that the company's efforts to promote diversity amount to racial discrimination. The plaintiff, a shareholder, objected to hiring goals, awarding contracts to diverse suppliers, and including executive pay metrics that were tied to diversity. So this has come up on one of my boards so far, but is this something that any of you have, has this come up on your boards? What do you think about it? Do you think this is a one-off, or do you think this potentially ends up getting legs? Maria?
It has not come up on our boards yet. Having said that, I think board members get sued all the time for different things.
Not all the time.
Well, I mean, right.
We're not going to convince any of these people to take a board.
No. But I mean, like, there are things that come up in terms of your fiscal responsibility and your governance responsibility. So I'm not frightened by this. I think there will always be people that have a different point of view. What we look for as a board is that DEI is part of the strategic imperative of the company, that we're governing it and managing it the way it should be, going back to what we said earlier, that we make progress, that we have the right metrics, that we are transparent, that we disclose, and we really understand the disclosures. And I think ESG is going to help us. So the S in ESG helps us. And certainly on where I chair the audit committee at S&P Global, we are moving toward a SOX-like approach to our ESG metrics, which will include our social metrics. And I think at the end of the day, we as board members need to stand for what's right. And occasionally, not all the time, but occasionally, people will not agree, and they will file suits. But my personal opinion is that I don't know that it'll be a one-off. My hope would be it's a one-off, but even if it's not, we've got to do the right thing.
Yay!
I would just add that, it's important to look at the details too. So, I mean, I think Starbucks is one example, but there's been all sorts of headlines on, less institutional support for ESG related matters. But when you sort of dig into that a little bit, what you're hearing is, either they don't want to be overly prescriptive with the company. They feel like the company is making progress on some of these issues, so they're choosing not to vote against the company on these issues. So I think it really, it's important to sort of look a little bit beyond the headlines sometimes.
Others? Tony?
So Maria so eloquently said it. I don't know that I can add much, but I will add just some observations from some other board leaders. And I'm going to quote one who has spent a lot of time in this space, and that's Melody Hobson. And Melody has talked about the 3 P's, which is philanthropy, people, and purchasing power. And she uses those 3 P's as challenging her boardrooms around what's the representation in DEI look like for from a diversity set of lenses. What does it look like in terms of our business partners and giving others opportunities? So what does our supplier base look like? And then lastly, what's our philanthropy and how are we uplifting the community as a whole? So interesting enough, it happens to be Starbucks, but she has been saying this for, multiple decades, if you will, she and John Rogers.
And just on that point, it did come up in an annual meeting where one of the CEOs of a board company I'm on got this question kind of almost exactly like this. And to your point, Tony, she answered, so now you can see who it was, that it is about we want our employees, our employees to reflect the customers we serve, the suppliers that supply us, the communities we're in, right? It's that simple. And I think if we sort of stick to that, as well as your points, Maria, about how this is part of our strategy to do that, then that's where we are.
And not to mention all the research that says that if you have diversity, you're more likely to improve your profitability, your innovation, make better decisions. There are good reasons why businesses want a more diverse population.
Great. Lisa, you briefly touched on the ESG and just sort of those metrics, and I think you have a little bit of a, I don't know whether it's a pulse survey or something about where we are on ESG and how that's tracking, because there is a little bit of this backlash about ESG and
Sure. First of all, I think we all know in this room that ESG is super broad, right? So even within the E, are you talking about recyclability? Are you talking about greenhouse gas emissions? Are you talking about water usage? And we can take it through every letter, and there's a lot underneath the hood there. So I think it's hard to talk about ESG as a thing. What we have found through some of the Diligent Institute studies that we've done is that 43% of boards have ESG at the full board level, meaning they don't have it relegated to a committee. They talk about it at the full board level. About 15% have it in a specific committee. Those tend to be companies that for whom ESG, and particularly the E, is an existential risk. So oil and gas, heavy manufacturing, that kind of thing. So they tend to have a separate committee that's what they focus on. I think you could make the argument either way. We also see it layered into Nom and Gov quite a bit. But I would say, and comp committee for say on pay related issues and pay equity related issues. I think it will depend a little bit on the industry and a little bit on the nature of the company. And certainly I would say, I'd be shocked if the board panel here didn't say, we all talk about this at the board level, even if it is, committee specific in some ways, because it has sort of come to that, as I said, there's only 4% of companies that say they're talking about this rarely. So people are having this conversation in the boardroom on a fairly regular basis.
I want to turn now to talent, and I want to kind of make this board members in action. Because we go to meetings, we sit there, we listen to stuff, we respond, we give thoughts, we give advice, but we do stuff outside the boardroom too. And Paul, I was particularly struck by some of your stories about, and we're most interested often in getting to know the talent, right? The next layer down, the layer below that, and just how are those folks potentially being on succession lists for CXO jobs. So tell us a little bit about what you do, and others jump in too.
Yeah, sure. I really make a point to get to know the talent and to go beyond the people that we see in the boardroom. I do, if I see, especially for women and people of color. So if we get presenters in the boardroom, I may send them a LinkedIn request afterwards and then follow up with an email to say, hey, let's get together for a coffee or a Zoom or a dinner or something. And the CEO knows that I'm going to do this. I'm well known for getting to know the talent because, and then the other way is to, I'll go to town halls and I'll meet talent there. Accenture does a great job of having immersion programs and leadership programs and getting a pound of flesh out of the directors to come in and lead some of those sessions. And that allows me an opportunity to get to know people because as Tony said earlier, it's so important when you're sitting in these succession planning conversations to really be informed about the talent. And so when we're talking about specific roles and people are, saying, well, we don't have a woman or a person of color to go into this job, you can say, well, what about, such and such? What about Anne? And they may say, well, Anne hasn't had the necessary experience. We think really highly of her, but she hasn't had the experience. So then you can advocate for a plan that gets Anne the necessary experience so that the next time or the time after that, when we're talking about that role, Anne will be a part of that group. So really going deep into the organization and getting to know the people allows you to have a much more robust and meaningful conversation during succession planning meetings.
I agree with that 100%. And I was in a situation, I actually came to Informa via an acquisition. And so I knew the people of the acquired company better than the acquirees did because I had worked with them longer. So it was very helpful. I had spent quite a bit of time in China visiting shows pre-pandemic, of course. So in addition to Hong Kong jewelry, which was great, a beauty show, a dental show, which I really do not recommend. Lots of good stuff and videos you really don't want to see. But when you're walking the floor, with the people that are, the product managers of the shows, you're getting the feel for how they think, how their exhibitors are responding to them, and you're just getting a feel for the business that you can't any other way. One of the other things that I like about Informa is where there are affinity groups, and we have 4 affinity groups. They have assigned a board director to each affinity group. So we are their board sponsor, and it's up to the group as much or as little as they want to engage us, and that's also super helpful for getting to know diverse talent.
Talk about ERGs. Anyone else? Do you get to go see them and?
Absolutely. Employee resource groups have been an integral part of getting board members connected. And what's great is the CEOs, I think going back to what Paul said, our CEOs are encouraging it. So we're not kept at arm's length. Another thing that we do a lot of in both public boards is walkabouts. I think it goes back to what Paul said. She was, obviously at a big event, but just being able to walk around the floors, shake hands, meet people, and certainly in S&P Global, we go around the globe. Each year we go to one place outside the U.S., and it's very structured. I mean, we are seeing new things in action, new data being leveraged, new technology, et cetera, but we have the time to interact with the people. And I think to Paula's point, the only other thing I would say is it's our obligation, but I think board members increasingly are having opinions on individuals underneath the operating committee. And so when succession's coming up, what about so-and-so? And if they're not ready, help us understand their development plan so they will be ready next time.
And it's so important because you get presented all this stuff. If you haven't met these people, you just sort of say, okay. And I think this really gives an opportunity, as you both have said, to really ask questions. And I dare say, because is that the board where it's the women that have chair of the committees and all that? No. Okay. But I think the interest in ERGs, in my experience, has been the women and the men of color who took an interest in these and really did it. And I think we have to encourage all to do it. Any other thoughts on stuff you do outside the boardroom? Okay. Last topic on people, and yeah, we're doing fine. the SEC has just put in new pay for performance rules, and they're intended to better show the relationship between executive comp, actual executive comp, what people are paid, and the company's financial performance. And they include in there required total shareholder return, TSR, and net income. But these rules go into effect now. In other words, the next proxies that are issued anytime after December, it's going to have. We have to be ready for this. And Tony, I know you had some comments on this. I mean, is this new rule good?
The jury's still out, in my opinion. I think the intent is the right intent, but it's complicated. And Roxanne and I were just talking about this earlier in terms of what companies are going to have to do, because to your point, it'll be in the 2023 proxy statement, and it's a lot of work. It's going to require you looking at analysis to understand which internal financial measure you're going to use, because there's going to be two from the SEC and then one financial measure that you can elect to use. And you're going to have to do the analysis to say what is the best measure to put you in a good light. The second thing that's complicated about it is who is your peer group, and so whether or not that's going to be at an S&P 500 level or within your industry, you're going to have to look at the selection of that peer group and run the analysis based on that. At the end of the day, this actual compensation, actual pay is an interesting term because it's really not actual. It's a theoretical actual, as we called it in our boardroom. And so, as you look over time, you'll get better at this analysis and understanding it. With that, you're looking at the CEO, and then you're looking at an average of the executive team, the named executives. And that average can change also because we all know that the executives and the CEOs will change out over time. So I think it's going to
Because it's 5 years. You have to.
yeah,
present that.
and it's 5 years. So it's going to be 3 years, I think, now, and then it'll be 4 years next year, and 5 years the subsequent years out. It will be this 5-year view, and so the jury's still out, in my opinion, because that's a lot of variables that you have to consider as you're rolling it out.
Yeah, and I think on the pay, it's probably less theoretical than it was before, but it's still
It's still theoretical.
not actual.
Particularly for industries where there's a big equity component in the
Right.
pay, the swings
Right.
could make the ratios nonsensical.
And whatever day you value that equity on could be good or
Could really
Well, and
flip.
it's not necessarily new, right? I mean, my first job when I graduated from college in 1989 was executive compensation consultant, and we were tying company performance to executive pay. Most companies recognize that humans are coin operated, and you should try to align those things and reward them for doing things that build the shareholder value in the company. So I think a lot of companies are doing that. I think the more interesting piece is the layer below that, where I don't know if Maria Colarusso is in the room. I think she's coming here later. But what is the pay equity across your organization? Are you paying people for the same thing for the same type of work and the same experience levels and things like that? I think most companies have a peer group that they compare themselves to that is
you
pressure
have to
tested
in the proxy.
Absolutely. So it feels a tiny bit redundant to me, but I'm open to see.
So we'll see. This is the first one that's out there. There's also new rules proposed for cyber. And
Maybe you take that cyber and comment on it too, because we're also focused on that.
okay, great. I was going to do one other as my last question, but we'll do cyber real quick. Cyber, this is definitely a board topic. I mean, for sure. It's in the committees. It's at the board level. And I guess I'll ask all of us, how is the oversight evolving? And I think, Tony, you already talked a little bit about specific talent versus broader technology talent. But what do we need to do in terms of getting board competency, i.e. education level, et cetera, up to the point it needs to be in order that we can continue to provide oversight of cyber? Because it's not going away. Mary, you want to start?
Oh, sure. We rely heavily on the expertise of the audit committee that has obviously the primary responsibility, but it is a frequent topic at the board level. I will say on Autodesk, 3 of us are taking an MIT class this fall on cybersecurity for directors. I don't know if it's any good yet, but if it's good, I'll let you know, just to get more conversant with the topics. Obviously, that doesn't make us cybersecurity experts, but
Well, we don't necessarily have to be.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really about asking the right questions, right, and being aware of the issue. So also have taken a cybersecurity certification, and Diligent is developing one as well because we're getting a lot of those inbound requests. But I think it's we talk about having people who are T-shaped, where they have broad expertise in strategic oversight and then deep expertise in something. I think more boards will be looking for deep expertise in cyber-related issues or technology. Even just technological disruption. But somebody who's an expert operator today is outdated 2 years from now if they leave and sit on a board. So it's really about being aware and asking the right questions.
Great.
Within our audit committee meetings, we do have cybersecurity experts, but to your point, they are former executives. And so we also use external parties to come in and talk to us and to assess our cybersecurity program. The CISO, we stay very close to them in all cases. They report to the audit committee quarterly and also to the full board at least once a year. Another board does it 2 times a year, so it's different according to the boards. What I'm finding, because I sit on so many audit committees, is that there is a standard, that they all follow, the NIST standard and other standards that they follow, but there is a format that helps you to look from one cyber security program to the next and make sure those things are there. It helps you tailor your questions. There are all kinds of ways to stay educated about it, but really we're very fortunate to have the cybersecurity experts on the team.
And we do very similar to what Paula was just outlining. I just would make one point about cyber. People talk to the CISOs. We do the same, the NIST framework, et cetera. But a lot of the issues are in the app development area, and understanding the ecosystem, understanding all the new tools that are out there. It's hard for boards to keep up with that, but I think some of these certifications, as well as we've been moving toward teach-ins, where the CISO will actually bring in external people for the board outside of the boardroom to help us understand a lot of that ecosystem so we can ask the right questions.
The only thing I would add to that is I think it's really important for the board to call an independent assessment. And absolutely you can do the NIST framework, and I'm a believer in the NIST framework, but there's nothing better than having real experts come in and say, okay, did you know this happened? Or we pounded away and we got in here. And so I think just being able to have like real action-oriented independent assessments is important. Okay, so few minutes left. I didn't want to not get to this question because there is very much, I think, on all of our minds, what's the future going to be like? What's going to happen with inflation? 91% of CEOs that were surveyed said we're going to have a recession within the next 12 months. So the pandemic wreaked havoc on global supply chains. They're not all the way back. Demand is wavering. Labor probably will start to loosen. You can just feel it. Mortgage rates are way up. So what are the best companies doing to prepare for that? And we'll just go down the line. Mary, you want to go first?
I think global diversification is really important in this era. When all the things went on with the UK budget that we've sort of been, glued to CNBC watching lately, it was a comfort that a UK-based company was able to send a note saying, we only have this % revenue in the UK. We are a global company, so we are impacted, but it's not wiping us out. So I think diversification in portfolio and geography is important.
Yes.
I love that one. I would say, it's also boards plan for this. We have enterprise risk matrices for a reason. And so, I would say, if boards haven't really taken a hard look at that risk matrix and said, have we really thoughtfully had planning around the high risk issues, then now would be the time to do that.
Great. Mine would be scenario planning. think if you can get companies to really think about what are likely scenarios here and start to play them out, then if one of those happens, it's not emotional. It's like we said we were going to do this if this happens, and that's what we're going to do.
I was going to say scenario planning too. One of the
Paula and I, the accountants.
Yeah, one of the things that the pandemic taught us really is how to manage through uncertainty, and scenario planning was a big part of that. During the pandemic, very often we didn't know which scenario we were on because things were changing so rapidly. So we can also bring in some external speakers to put some of these big macro events into context, so we can bring in, global economists. We also have the Russia-Ukraine war. We can bring in, we have brought in former defense secretaries to come and give us a perspective on that. So and also now we know how to do these things virtually, so it makes it easier to get these kind of speakers who can come and talk to the board about these. Just to put it in context, I mean, nobody knows, right, what scenario will play out. So scenario planning and trying to stay as informed as we can.
Really good. Tony.
Ditto to what everyone has said thus far. I will talk to maybe one other dimension of these challenges, and that's climate change, because I'm serving on a board of a property and casualty insurance company, and in that regard, we are asking ourselves, how do we change our market portfolio? Because it's, Florida's Florida, and tornadoes
Florida.
in the Midwest, and
Texas. Yep.
and so we're looking at weather, climate, bringing in weather experts to try to understand that. And to your point, it is all about scenario planning.
Being the last one, I would say ditto, but I would say diversification's been one of the things, but also really looking at the portfolio of products and services. If you're in hobbies, it's not a good time to be in hobbies. So we're looking at culling the product set in some cases. In risk management, historically, everything was a little linear, and this is a very different recessionary environment we're going into. So as a board, we're pushing on tipping points and triangulating all the different things that are going on, and that gets to a bit of the scenario planning. And we're also looking kind of across the world at, we just did a tabletop exercise on China as an example at S&P Global, where we were taking all these different aspects into consideration. And while the board wasn't directly engaged, we got all the report outs. In other cases, we're directly in that scenario work.
Wow, great answers. I'm going to end this a little early because you all have been so patient sitting with us all this time. Thank you. Please thank our incredible panelists.